When you take a drive through the country, you'll probably see a classic corral fence. I have one at the ranch on my garden railroad, which is a quality plastic product from Pico. It's been there for several years, and I expect it'll be there for many more. This fence is attached to the ground behind a retaining wall, which keeps the ground very stable. The fence at the farm, on the other hand, is on a slope, and when the ground is unstable and shifts even a little bit, the small pins at the end of the rail disengage and the fence falls apart. So I need a post with a more secure attachment to the rails. I found these popsicle sticks in the craft store. 3 laminate together is about the same cross section as the plastic post. I also found thinner sticks which are about the same cross section as the rail, but somewhat shorter. This will require the posts to be closer together, but that's a good thing where the ground isn't very stable. I cut one rounded end off of some of the popsicle sticks. Then I determined where to clamp the stop block on my miter saw. And this block will ensure that I cut all of the post pieces to the same length. Next, I determine spacing between the rails. I make the space between the ground and the first rail the same as the space between the other rails. Now I reset my stop block and I cut some spacers. Next, I glue the spacers to the post. Starting at the bottom, I use a small piece of rail to determine the location of successive spacers. I close out the post by gluing the other side piece in place. With hand assembly, the parts are not quite straight and square, but a slight sanding results in a nice fence post. I glue on a top cap, which conveniently is the same size as the 3 internal spacers. Then I drill a 1/16 of an inch hole about 1/4 of an inch deep into the bottom of the post to accept a 1/16 inch brass rod that will be used as a stake to hold the post to the ground. The post spacers are thicker than the rails, so the slot in the post is wider than one rail, but not wide enough for 2. By putting a slight taper on the end of the rail, the slot will accept both rails and they will wedge tightly into the post. To make a gate, I cut some rail stock slightly larger than the distance from the top of the top rail to the bottom of the bottom rail. Then I position them on the fence section to frame out the gate. The completed non-operating gate looks something like this. I use some of the rounded edge cutoffs to represent hinges. I also framed both sides of the gate. The corral fence needs to be able to follow the contour of the land. The rails should be loose enough in the slots in the post to allow the fence section to parallelogram a little bit. If the fence as built doesn't allow adequate alignment, taper the top and bottom edges of the rail a little bit to get more swing. Paint adds appearance and longevity. Indoor-outdoor craft paint works well on garden railroad structures. I use gloss white on the fence because the wood is porous enough to end up with a semi-gloss finish, and it still retains some of its wood grain appearance. If you intend to make several posts, it's easier to use an assembly jig. At the top of my jig, I have the part masters. These are the only parts that I pre-cut. I use these samples as a guide for making more parts later on. The assembly tool is scrap wood pieces attached to a base. They're sized and positioned to establish the spacing between the spacers and to help with proper alignment. One post side is slid into the tool and pressed against the side and bottom stops. A drop of glue is applied on the post to each spacer location. The post needs to be held against the stops during assembly or it will shift. If the spacer is dropped in place, it will float on top of the glue. Push it against the side stop to square it up and then press it down to seat it. This is repeated with all 3 spacers. I make the top spacer from scrap wood. The pre-cut spacer was too small to handle. The oversized spacer is easier to work with and it can be trimmed later. Next, glue is applied to the spacers. Too little glue and it won't hold, but too much glue and it will squeeze out of the joint and glue the post permanently to the tool. I usually remove the post from the tool as soon as possible before the glue that did get between the post and tool has time to take a permanent set. The post should be clamped until the glue has fully cured to get the strongest bond. Then the top spacer is trimmed in the miter box. The finished post will have small misalignment, but it's faster and easier to assemble than freehand, and the part requires much less sanding to finish. I taper both ends of the rail on the same side, so it's easy to remember which side is tapered. When connecting rail ends taper to taper, they run out straight. So the rails inserted into the post taper to taper will result in a fence line running straight, something like this. However, when connecting the rail ends taper to flat, the rails run out at a slight angle. So if the rails are inserted taper to flat in the fence post, the fence line will run at an angle. This could be a problem for a straight line fence, but it could be used to make gently curving fence lines. Either way, it's important to be aware of the orientation of the taper when installing the fence. Installing the fence is pretty easy. If you have a fence post already started, then all you need to do is take a rail and slide it into the wedge in the slot. Oops, that's off at an angle. I got the wedges reversed. I have to readjust the faces. Put all three of them in place, and it'll pretty much hold itself aligned while you're off getting the post. Now you insert the rails into the post, so this way they go all the way into the slot, but they don't quite come out the other side. Line up the post, press it down, and you're ready to do the next section of fence. I wasn't able to come up with anything clever where I have a sharp corner, so I just glued two fence posts together. I made a custom top cap, and I blocked off the area where the openings in the slots would have shown. So I hope you found this video useful and keep your cows safe. If you did, share it with a friend, maybe give it a like, and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching.